Hi, this is Congressman Tom Cole. This is another one of our weekly chats about what's going on in Congress. Right now, frankly, in terms of floor activity or even committee activity, not a great deal is going on. And that's too bad, but it's really a product of a Democratic decision made earlier this year to try and pass bills all on their own with very narrow majorities. We saw them do that in the so-called American Rescue Plan, a $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill that could have been a compromise bill of more in the order of $600 to $800 billion, and that would have been on top of what Congress did in a bipartisan fashion the year before. As a matter of fact, this year's been disappointing because actually in 2020, while it was an exceptionally difficult year, we had coronavirus, we had all the economic disruptions that came from that, and of course we had a very bitter election. And yet Congress actually functioned last year surprisingly well. We passed 5 relief packages of over $4 trillion, and we did them in a very bipartisan way. Majorities of each party recognized we were in a major national crisis, and we worked together and I think saved the economy. I think history will look at what Congress did in 2020 in that regard very favorably. And we also funded the government, again, in a bipartisan way. We worked across the aisle, and substantial majorities of both parties voted for the funding bill. So we didn't hear any talks about government shutdowns. And finally, we even voted together in terms of making sure the National Defense Authorization Act passed for the 60th straight year. And again, that was done in an overwhelmingly bipartisan fashion and over a presidential veto with both parties working together. So we know Congress can function together when it chooses to, but when one party tries to go it alone, and that's what Democrats have done this year, problems inevitably arise. And they arise simply because the majorities the Democrats have are simply very narrow. It's 50-50 in the United States Senate. The Democrats currently hold a majority of about 3 to 4 votes in the House of Representatives, and so they literally have to have every single vote from every one of their members if they choose not to include Republicans in the discussions, the deliberations, and the final resolution of the problems in front of the country. There are 4 big items in front of us right now. The first item is the debt ceiling. There was a measure of bipartisan cooperation on that in the United States Senate, and it was extended through December 3rd. So that still needs to be resolved on a more long-term basis than this, and Democrats have the votes to do that. We'll see if they can. Second is the so-called bipartisan infrastructure package. That's a bill, quite frankly, that I don't support. Neither of our senators supported it when it was dealt with in the Senate. And they opposed it for, I think, some very good reasons. First, normally in transportation infrastructure bills, we pay for them. And this bill, while its author said it was paid for, it's simply not. The Congressional Budget Office has said it's about $400 billion worth of new debt. Second, the bill never moved through either of the infrastructure committees, neither the Senate or here. It was negotiated by a group of senators, and I'm sure their states were taken care of, but nobody was there at the table to look after Oklahoma. And frankly, in the case of the infrastructure bill as currently written, nobody in the House of Representatives on either side of the aisle had anything to do with it. So those 2 reasons are pretty good reasons. The additional debt, the fact that it's very narrowly crafted, and that honestly Oklahoma's not been adequately served, I think is the reason for our opposition. But if Democrats put the bill on the floor, there's enough votes to pass it. They simply have chosen not to do that. The reason why they've chosen not to do that is the third item that could come up between now and the end of the year, and that's the so-called reconciliation package. This is a massive tax and spending package. We don't know the exact cost. We don't know the exact taxes. We don't know very much about it because it's still being negotiated inside the Democratic Party, again, without any Republican participation whatsoever. Now, to get that passed, they're going to need all 50 Democrats, almost every single Democrat in the House. And obviously, they're going to have to use an unusual procedure, again, budget reconciliation as it's called, which allows them to get around the filibuster. That bill, which is, again, major tax increases, major debt, Lots of controversial proposals, things like increasing the tax on natural gas, something that would affect every American in terms of heating and cooling their homes, or the cost of energy. Those things are simply an anathema and not likely to get much Republican support. So again, Democrats are working to come to an agreement. They've told us in the past that they expect that to happen. They've missed all their deadlines so far. The latest deadline is October 31st. We'll see whether or not that happens. But so far, they've not been able to achieve, an agreement. And then, of course, finally, we have to fund the government. We actually have to make sure that we don't have a government shutdown. Again, the Democrats have sort of stalled out here. They've passed 9 of the 12 appropriations bills in the House, but only 3 in the Senate. So my guess is toward the end of the year, certainly sometime in December, we'll have to have some sort of patch to make sure that the government doesn't shut down while they continue to try and work out their differences. In that area, hopefully they'll come to an agreement with Republicans, because it's going to require Republican votes to do anything other than just simply flatline our current spending. And that means not making the adjustments we need to make in important programs, not particularly spending as much on defense as we currently do. So again, there are big controversies ahead of us, but so far the Democrats, who after all do control the presidency, the Senate, and the House, have yet to come to agreements. We did have one significant action on the floor this week, which sadly was unsuccessful, and that was a Republican effort to deal with the Democratic plan to hire tens of thousands of additional IRS agents and, frankly, monitor the spending, the bank accounts of almost every single American. We have legislation to prevent that, to make sure that your private bank transactions are not reported to the IRS. We tried to bring that to the floor, but in what was essentially a straight party line vote, the Democrats refused to hear that legislation. They intend to massively increase the size of the Internal Revenue Service and to monitor the spending habits of every single American. That's a gross invasion of your personal privacy. Again, no Republican is likely to support anything like that. So again, while we're doing our best to stop it, it'll be tied up in the reconciliation package if the Democrats ever agree on that. So we're moving toward decisive action that literally could result in a government shutdown if we can't come to an agreement, or could result in, again, another stopgap measure, keeping the government open for a matter of weeks while we try to work through our differences. This can change if Democrats want to sit down and work with the Republicans. We can have an infrastructure bill whenever they want to put it on the floor. Matter of fact, today there's an additional infrastructure bill that has passed the Senate. It would allow the spending of $500 billion in COVID relief money that's already gone out the doors on infrastructure. Every single Democrat and Republican in the Senate voted for that bill. It passed on Wednesday. We hope that it will come up in the House of Representatives, but we have no guarantee that the Democrats, Speaker Pelosi, will actually put that legislation on the floor. That's too bad. When an idea is so good that every single member of the United States Senate agrees to it, then that bill probably at least ought to come for consideration on the floor, and it would help us with infrastructure immediately. Again, this is money that's already gone out the door, more money than was needed for COVID relief, quite frankly, and we'd simply be allowing each state to take that money, which they have not yet spent, and spend it on infrastructure if they decided that was the right thing to do. That is a very common sense, good idea. Again, it passed the Senate unanimously. The minute it goes on the House floor, the Republicans have already pledged, look, we will vote for this bill. We'll send it on to President Biden. He would surely sign it, and we would be able to take money that's now sitting locked up, and I think probably unnecessarily so, on COVID, and say, if you decide in Oklahoma that this makes more sense to spend this on roads and highways and bridges and ports or waterways, then go right ahead and do it. That would be, I think, something helpful to the economy and something that Democrats and Republicans would be proud of. But again, no word yet as to whether or not the Democrats will actually move. So I think the next few weeks promise to be very intense in Washington. Again, the big debates right now are inside the Democratic Party. They won't put a bipartisan infrastructure bill on the floor that would pass until they resolve them. And until they come to agreement amongst themselves, it looks like everything else is going to be tied up. Republicans aren't going to be voting to increase taxes, aren't going to be voting for major expansions of the IRS, aren't going to be allowing the federal government to get in your checkbooks and look at every single transaction that you have. And Democrats know that. So again, right now, since they have no agreement amongst themselves and no support amongst Republicans for some of their major proposals, Congress is stalled. And that's literally a failure of the president, in my view, to lead, a failure of the Democrats to put their ducks in a row, and more importantly, a colossal failure to sit down in a very narrowly divided Congress and work together, find the areas that you can agree and move ahead. When Democrats decide to do that, I think they'll find willing partners in Republicans. And again, I just point to last year where the two parties worked together on every appropriations bill, worked together on the crisis of coronavirus, and work together to make sure that the common defense was provided for. When we do that, we can get a lot of things done, even during difficult elections, even during a time of national crisis. But this year, so far, Democrats have chosen a go-it-alone strategy, and I think that's what's causing the bottleneck here at the end of the year. They simply don't have the votes to match up with their ambitions, and they're trying to dragoon, every member of their own party to vote for things that many members, or at least several members of their own party, are unwilling to vote for. In that sense, a lot of the actions in the United States Senate, where Senator Manchin from West Virginia and Senator Sinema from Arizona have expressed different levels of concern about this reconciliation bill, and literally their own parties trying to blackmail them into supporting something that they don't think is in the best interest of the people of their state. So how that story plays out is anybody's guess. I will tell you this, again, we worked together last year. When Democrats make the decision that they want to sit down and work together this year or next year, then I think they'll find willing partners with Republicans, just as they did during the coronavirus crisis, just as they did during the appropriations process of last year. But Republicans are not going to vote for major tax increases, are not going to vote for uncontrolled spending, and are certainly not going to vote to plunge the country deeper into debt unless there's an agreement about how to deal with that debt longer term and how to get our spending in order. So we'll look forward to next week. We're going to keep working away. We're going to certainly try to make sure that the IRS isn't expanded in some massive and intrusive way that's going to affect you. We've heard a lot from Oklahomans about that, frankly, in the last few weeks as they've become familiar with that proposal. And I think their judgment is overwhelmingly negative on that Democratic proposal. And the votes of our delegation certainly reflect that. I think that's probably true across the country. This is something progressives want to do, that proponents of larger, more expensive government want to do, not something that the average American, I think, is very supportive of. So again, we're going to keep fighting a good fight, and I hope I have more and better news for you next week. But again, until the Democrats resolve their internal differences and tensions, it's going to be very difficult for Congress to move ahead unless Democrats make the decision to work with Republicans. If they do, just as in 2020, we can work together, we can get big things done and help the country through a difficult time. But neither party's strong enough to, frankly, dictate to the others and to act on their own. When you get in a situation like this that you won't talk to the other side, you empower every single senator in your own party or every single House member to adopt extreme stands and to hold progress up. That's what's happening with Democrats right now. So hopefully they'll get over it, work with Republicans, or at least manage to come to an agreement amongst themselves, and we can have at least some areas of progress. But that hasn't happened yet. We'll see how we do next week.